Welcome to 10 Kids, 2 Docs. I'm Dr. Vivian Carlin, and I'm joined by my dear friend and co-host, Dr. Sylvia Bank. Between our two households, we're navigating life with 10 children, so we know how chaotic parenting can be. As Johns Hopkins trained pediatricians, we also know the science. Our goal is to bring you the best of both worlds, medically sound, trustworthy advice, and practical, real-world insights as we dive into the trials and triumphs of parenting. Please note this podcast is not intended to be a substitute for medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment from your doctor. So today is our day. We get to kind of look back on the things that we've talked about in the past couple of months and just discuss things that are on our mind, things that we've seen in the news related to these topics. So we did 2 episodes in March on food allergies, which is such a big topic for so many parents and pediatricians. And there's stuff continuously in the news about food allergies. So I'm curious your thoughts on this topic.
So going through recent articles on pediatric medicine, they had this article that came out in Frontiers in Immunology, and it was just kind of like a review of oral immunotherapy, how it works for different foods that people are allergic to, and it hypothesized on the mechanism in which oral immunotherapy is working. So people seek oral immunotherapy is potentially saving lives from anaphylaxis from ingestion, right?
Yeah. And it's interesting when these things just come up. I would assume you weren't searching for it. It just comes up in your natural news feed and news sources, both pediatric and non-pediatric, right? I see these things in science all the time. So oral immunotherapy, so exciting.
It was funny because right around the pandemic, I think my child was 12 or 13. Oral immunotherapy was really taking off. And I remember reading an article at that time saying that they were doing it up to age 12 or up to age 13 at that time. And I remember making an appointment with my son's allergist. And at that time, it was a virtual appointment because it was during the pandemic. And we had a discussion as to, is this window closing for my child to have this type of oral immunotherapy? What do you think? Do you think we should start doing that now? So I remember seeing it during that time, like 2020, 2021 range, and wondering whether or not my child would be a candidate for that. Interestingly enough, the allergist at that time had said, we're not missing a window because maybe this field will expand into adulthood, and then this child could explore that type of therapy later on as well. It's not like the door will close when he turns 14, right?
Yeah, super interesting.
Do you have any interesting articles or any bits of news that you've seen recently?
Yeah, so I think what most caught my attention and had been on my mind, particularly being that it's Autism Awareness Month, and we just released these 2 episodes with that fantastic discussion with Dr. Teresa Lyons on autism and what that looks like, is I saw an article come up on my newsfeed. It was a Washington Post article, and it was discussing a study that was released earlier in 2025. This was a study in Nature Genetics, and the title of it's just going to not make any sense. It says, Decomposition of Phenotypic Heterogeneity in Autism Reveals Underlying Genetic Programs. So it wouldn't be an article that, as a layperson, or even me as a pediatrician, would just pull up and be like, okay, I'm going to read this whole thing thoroughly, right? But the mainstream media caught my attention to it. And basically what they did, so first, what this made me think is a super interesting thing to make our listeners aware of is there are multiple research foundations out there that have been gathering huge amounts of data on individuals with autism. And sometimes that includes genetic data, like of their individuals' genomes, and it often includes a lot of information on what are the particular signs and symptoms for that individual. So then you've got huge amounts of data that can be analyzed. And this study, they looked at 5,000 individuals, right? And they took the data on these individuals, and they had 239 different features of autism. Those are called phenotypes in medical language. Basically, when they were able to subdivide these phenotypes, they found these 4 different trends. I'll try to describe what the 4 trends were. So one was kids that were broadly affected, right? These might be ones on the severe end of the spectrum. 10%, they faced the steepest challenges in communication. They marked developmental delays that were picked up early on, and then repetitive behaviors that people think about with autism. There was another group that was like a mixed autism with developmental delay, still had developmental delays, but were mixed in how much that interfered with their communication or repetitive behaviors. The third group was entitled moderate challenges. That was about a third of patients. They had social and communication differences and repetitive habits, but they were much subtler and they were without developmental delays, right? So their development was looking normal in infancy and early toddlerhood, and then they developed these things. So this is very similar to the description we hear of a lot of parents with kids with high functioning autism, right? They're diagnosed later in life. And then the final group they termed social and or behavioral. This was the largest group. This was almost 40%. They met their early developmental milestones on time and then grappled with other social conditions later on, like ADHD, social anxiety, depression, OCD, and ultimately were diagnosed with autism that way. So what was really interesting, if you can follow the logic of this for just a minute, is that once in these 5,000 patients, they identified these 4 different categories. None of this is perfect, right? But these 4 broad categories of the patients they were analyzing with autism. They then could take all of this incredible amount of genetic data that they had on these 5,000 kids and look and see if there was any correlation with those 4 types and differences in the genetic data. And they did find that there was a difference in what's called genetic signaling, like minor changes that change how the DNA signals the cell. You have your genetic code, but its expression can change at different stages in development. So the most positive association they found was that these 4 groups did show some distinction in patterns of genetic signaling. So while this doesn't change anything right now, it's opening this window more and more into our understanding of autism, like what is causing these changes in genetic signaling and opportunities for further research into this. And I feel like the reason this is important is that I've been saying for a long time, we refer to autism as a spectrum, but autism is probably more an umbrella term because we know kids present so differently and they look so distinct from each other. And I hope that as we identify more and more the root causes, the differences in how autism presents, the differences not just genetically, but biochemically and in brain structure, we actually are able to subdivide autism into more specific categories, because then that helps us drive how we inform parents, how we project what things will look like in the future, how we target therapies, and all of that. One of the things that's discussed in this paper is this idea that there's probably environmental and other exposures, right? We know this is so multifactorial that can affect this genetic expression or affect the development of autism. And it may be very much related to the timing of when that exposure happens. This was really well studied with thalidomide. Do you remember thalidomide?
Yes, I do. It was like the anti-nausea medicine that they would give pregnant women to help their morning sickness, right?
Yes, yes. And it was found fairly quickly that it was associated with really significant birth defects. And when I bring this up with people and they tell me they haven't heard of thalidomide, particularly if they're our age and remember the 80s and 90s music, I always ask, well, can you think of that word being used in We Didn't Start the Fire by Billy Joel, Children of
totally
Thalidomide?
Yes,
and
that's what I'm thinking.
Oh, that's what that's referring to. I had no idea what that was about. So it does get a shout out in that. But looking at this article, they mentioned this, and it caused me to look back that there was a study looking at autism related to thalidomide, because thalidomide had been so well studied, and it uncovered that the increased risk of autism in a child that had been exposed to thalidomide was only present if women took thalidomide between the 20th and 24th day after conception.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, right? It's this like tiny little narrow window, and then it's also causes you to just speculate and think, oh, well, that's why it's hard to say that thalidomide caused autism, because it was just this very narrow window.
Yeah. I have 2 things that I want to say about this. This is so interesting. Number one, when you talk about that exposure during a very limited time, maybe leading to different gene expression, eventually leads to a symptom like autism. So there was a 2026 study of over 200,000 births in Southern California, and found that pregnant women exposed to wildfire smoke were more likely to have children later diagnosed with autism. That was a strong association during the 3rd trimester of pregnancy. And then this other article that I came across talking about thyroid dysfunction during pregnancy may increase autism risk. And that was in the Journal of Clinical Endocrinology and Metabolism. So I'm going to put a link to those articles in the show notes so people can start seeing all of the information that's out there relating exposures to autism.
Yeah, yeah.
It really shows autism in general is so much more complex than how we would like it to be. We would like one cause, we stop that cause, and then autism is cured. But through this detailed research with a lot of data, they're finding the different presentations of autism, the potential different exposures at particular times leading to these symptoms. And it's just the tip of the iceberg about how complex this problem really is, right?
Yeah, you make me think of, in that same Washington Post article, they reference Dr. Mandel, a professor of psychiatry at the University of Pennsylvania, and he's part of a NIH-funded team that's trying to develop a predictive model to examine a wider range of environmental exposures. So medications, air quality, access to green space, the built environment, and the goal is to not just understand which factors matter, but when they matter. Like
yes.
The timing. And that's why it's, we can all think, I did this during pregnancy and my children don't have autism.
Yeah, like the Tylenol exposure, right?
Right. Or it's so hard to understand because it's so incredibly specific. It seems that's what the data so far seems to be suggesting.
Yeah. As we talked with Dr. Jackson in a previous autism series, we were briefly discussing leucovorin as a treatment for autism. As you have different phenotypic presentations and different causes of autism, perhaps the treatments can be very varied as well. Whereas this subtype may respond to leucovorin, but that one may not, for example. So I think that this is just the beginning of our understanding and our treatment modalities for this very complex medical problem, right?
Yeah, I certainly hope so.
I wanted to make one other point that listening to Teresa Lyons just kind of describe both her experience and the development of her Navigating Autism platform and how they help parents on a very individualized basis. I wanted to make the point that, so we're pediatricians, and in medicine, we like things to be very complete. Child has fever and sore throat. We do a strep test. It is positive. Here is your prescription. You get better. We're doctors. This is how we do medicine, right? And when you think of autism in that model, and it really came out in the way that she described all the different presentations, focusing on the 3 individual characteristics that you want to improve in your child to help his quality of life, your family quality of life, or whatever. Those 3 things are different for every family. And that's what makes autism diagnosis and treatment and management so unsatisfying from a doctor standpoint. Like, we want the diagnosis, we want the treatment, and we want the improvement. It is not a one treatment fits all when it comes to the varied presentations or the variable phenotypes that autism can present in. And therefore, there's this great need for a company like Teresa's to kind of hone in and on an individual basis, what can we do to improve our child's symptoms, right? It's fascinating to me to think of medicine that way, right?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I will say that another thing that you made me think of that was in this article was, as we make more discoveries that can lead to more accuracy in our diagnosis of autism, it's going to raise questions about whether autism should be seen as something to cure or as an essential facet to human diversity as well. Yeah. That we might find that there's these different categories, that some of these that we're referring to as autism are a very natural part of human diversity, and that it should be looked at that way as well. I love that.
Another piece of news that kind of highlights things that we've talked about and pediatrics is there's been a recent lawsuit that's been pretty high profile in the news, and many people may have heard about it. And this is a lawsuit of a 20-year-old who is suing social media, mainly Meta, TikTok, YouTube, and Snapchat. Have you heard about this?
Yes. I've heard about it in the news, but to be honest, I haven't followed the details of it, but I love the fact that it's happening. I'm so intrigued. Do you know more about it?
Yeah, so they call it a landmark social media addiction trial, and it's happening in Los Angeles. And it started several months ago, February 9th, 2026. So this is like recent, this year. And the case is called KGM versus Meta, Facebook, Instagram, right?
Yeah.
And the plaintiff is a 20-year-old who is suing the Meta platforms of Instagram and Facebook and the owner of YouTube, Google. And the trial claims that these platforms were designed to be addictive to children, contributing to mental health issues like depression, anxiety, and body dysmorphia in this plaintiff. And what's really interesting is that everybody is looking at this trial as like a bellwether case that could influence thousands of similar lawsuits. Interestingly enough, TikTok and Snapchat, who were originally named in this lawsuit, they actually settled outside of court. So they're not actually part of the court proceedings. And the amount of settlement that was given to KGM is private. We don't know how much they settled for.
Right. But clearly they were concerned enough to settle,
Yes.
right? Like there was enough of a risk. Even no matter what the verdict is, I love that this is even a thing. I mean,
Yeah.
in creating awareness and concern and maybe pressure to make change.
Right. We had talked about this in a previous recap in season 1 about Australia banning social media for children under 16. And that has gone into effect, right? Like that is taking place right now. And shortly after it happened, I think I heard in the news that there were a couple of teenagers that were suing the Australian government to get their Instagram back.
Right.
But I think
Right.
ultimately this has rolled out and that is taking place in Australia right now.
I love it.
Yeah.
So I feel like every time we do a look back or a recap, we could talk about autism and social media because they're always in the news. And I mean, it's so interesting because I have not felt this for the majority of my pediatric career. But right now, Sylvia, I feel like we are always in the news.
Right. Always in the news and vaccines as well, right? Vaccines and needles is in the news as well, right?
So-
Yeah, I'm looking forward to addressing some of the new recommendations coming out from the CDC for the new vaccine schedule. I think that we are planning on addressing some of the diseases that those vaccines cover to help our listeners perhaps make an informed decision about hepatitis A and B, the rotavirus, and the meningococcal vaccine. So that is something that I'm excited to do and continuing our vaccine series even further, correct?
I am looking forward to that. I also know that in this next set coming up, we're going to go back to talk about sleep, which we haven't talked about in a while.
Yeah.
Night terrors. Night terrors, something a lot of parents experience and can be terrifying. And then also sleep regression, toddler, school age, that, you know, your child forever was sleeping through the night just fine. And now all they want to do is be in your bed. So I'm looking forward to those discussions too.
Yeah, these are topics that I tackle on a regular basis in the practice. I think this is like a parenting model for me. So when you have a 1-year-old, the sleep training at that time is difficult to do. We talked about this in our sleep episode, the crying it out. It's very hard for parents to do. If you go ahead and do it, it works. When you think of the school age child that has sleep problems, it definitely could be nuanced, and listen to our episode for ideas about that. Or when you move on to like teenagers that have sleep problems.
Oh, yes.
If only the solution is let them cry it out for 3 days and then all your problems would be solved. Like, I think this just illustrates how parenting gets more and more complicated when your child gets older. So I think listeners will hear that as we describe sleep issues in the toddler and solutions for that, sleep issues in the school age child and what our advice is for that. It's not just a one-liner, it can be more complex, right?
Very, very true. Very true. Okay, well, this has been a fascinating discussion. I look forward to what's up ahead. I look forward to doing this again. And, you know, I'll keep scanning and watching for the articles that most catch my attention.
Yeah, and if anyone has any ideas or any topics they would like us to hit or highlight, please give us feedback. You can comment on our various social media platforms or write us on our feedback email, feedback@10kids2docs.com, and then we will highlight your issues on our show, right?
Yep, we love to hear from you.
I also want to just take this time out to thank our listeners again. We've really, this last interval, had a bump in our subscribership on all platforms. And it's really exciting to see us taking off, to see our platforms grow, and the people that are following us continues to grow. So thank you so much for listening and being a part of 10 Kids, 2 Docs.
Absolutely. We wouldn't be here if it weren't for our listeners. And, our hope and goal in this is to be helping parents make it through and help their parenting be less stressful, right?
Yeah.
So it brings us joy to do that.
Our TikToks are sparking conversation and support, and parents are telling some of their stories and able to relate to each other. And I love seeing that community grow as we look back to the Surgeon General's advisory, which kind of started our whole pilot and our season 2. It's supporting each other and just having a platform where parents can talk about their worst moment, thumb sucking, or what it was like when their child had strep throat. Like, it's just a nice way of just sharing and building a community of support amongst parents. And I love that.
I fully agree. Well, this is 10 Kids, 2 Docs. I'm Dr. Vivian Carlin.
And I'm Dr. Sylvia Bank. We'll see you next time.
See you next time.
Thank you for listening to 10 Kids, 2 Docs, hosted and created by Sylvia Bank and Vivian Carlin. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and recommend our podcast to other listeners. Visit our website at 10kids2docs.com, where you can find links to social media and leave comments or suggestions. Back next week with more topics in parenting.